Blood is supposedly thicker than water, but when millions of dollars are on the line, family ties evaporate in an instant. Scarlett was tossed onto the street by her own stepmother, with nothing but the deed to a rotting shack. But revenge, as they say, is a dish best served golden. The mahogany-paneled office of Thomas Abernathy, attorney at law, smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the suffocating tension of impending betrayal. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline was weeping its usual grey drizzle, a fitting backdrop for the burial of Arthur Hayes. Scarlett Hayes sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, her hands tightly clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. She was 26, wearing a simple black dress she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Across from her sat her stepmother Hannah, draped in custom-tailored Italian morning silk, smelling faintly of Chanel No. 5 and suppressed triumph. Beside Hannah lounged Preston Scarlett's stepbrother, who was currently occupied with checking his Rolex, rather than paying respects to the man who had just paid for his third sports car. Arthur Hayes Scarlett's father had built Hayes Logistics from a single delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar Pacific Northwest shipping empire. He had been Scarlett's hero, a man of calloused hands and warm smiles, until a severe stroke 5 years ago left him vulnerable to Hannah's meticulous manipulations. From that day on, Scarlett was slowly, methodically pushed out of her father's life. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Scarlett with a fleeting expression of deep pity before looking down at the heavy parchment on his desk. We come now to the distribution of the primary estate. Abernathy began, his voice dry and clinical. To my wife, Hannah Hayes, I leave the Mercer Island estate, the primary accounts, and a 60% controlling stake in Hayes Logistics. To my stepson, Preston, I leave a 40% stake in the company and the downtown penthouse. Scarlett felt the breath leave her lungs. Her father had built that company with her mother, who had passed away when Scarlett was 10. It was her legacy, too. She had worked in the warehouse during high school, learning the business from the ground up, while Preston was out wrecking luxury vehicles. And finally, Abernathy said, pausing. The silence in the room grew heavy. To my biological daughter, Scarlett Hayes, I leave the sum of $10,000 and the deed to the property known as the Oak Haven Cabin, located in the Cascade Mountains. Preston let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Oak Haven, isn't that the rotting shack up near Snoqualmie that Dad bought at a tax auction in the 90s? It is a rural acreage, yes, Abernathy said tightly. Hannah leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the glass table. Well, Arthur always was sentimental. Or perhaps he just finally recognized who was actually capable of running his empire. She turned her sharp, calculating gaze to Scarlett. $10,000 is more than generous for a girl who has contributed nothing to this family's social standing. I expect you to have your things out of the Mercer Island house by 5 o'clock this evening. Scarlett stared at her. My father just died, Hannah. I grew up in that house. And now it is my house, Hannah replied smoothly, standing up to signal the meeting was over. And I am renovating. The guest wing, your wing, is being gutted tomorrow. Be out by 5, Scarlett, or I'll have security pack your bags and leave them on the curb. Scarlett didn't argue. She knew a losing battle when she saw one. The woman had entirely rewritten Arthur's will while he was cognitively declining, but proving it in court would take millions of dollars Scarlett didn't have. By 4 p.m. Scarlett's entire life was stuffed into the trunk and back seat of her 12-year-old Honda Civic. As she drove off the island, watching the sprawling iron gates of her childhood home close behind her in the rearview mirror, a crushing wave of grief and betrayal washed over her. She pulled over on a side street in Bellevue, put her head on the steering wheel, and sobbed. She cried for her father, the man he used to be, and she cried for her own terrifying reality. She was essentially homeless, jobless, having been fired from Hayes Logistics by Preston the day after her father's passing, and left with a paltry check and a mysterious deed. Pulling herself together, Scarlett retrieved the deed from the manila folder Abernathy had given her. Oak Haven Cabin. She remembered her father taking weekend trips up there when she was a teenager. He always went alone, claiming he needed to do maintenance on the property, but he never took her. He always returned with dirt under his nails and a strange, secretive smile. With nowhere else to go, Scarlett put the car in drive and headed east on Interstate 90 toward the looming, fog-shrouded peaks of the Cascade Mountains. If that rotting shack was all she had left in this world, she was going to make it her fortress. The drive took nearly 2 hours the last 45 minutes, consisting of terrifyingly narrow, unpaved logging roads that threatened to tear the undercarriage of Scarlett's Civic right off. By the time the GPS lost its signal entirely, the sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long skeletal shadows across the dense pine forest. Finally, the road dead-ended into a gravel turnout choked with weeds. There, sitting in a small clearing heavily shadowed by towering Douglas firs, was Oak Haven Cabin. Preston had been right. It was a ruin. The roof sagged in the middle like a sway-backed horse. The front porch was covered in a thick layer of moss and decaying pine needles, and several of the windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. The structure was made of heavy, dark timber, but it looked as though a strong wind could flatten it. Scarlett stepped out of the car, the freezing mountain air instantly biting through her thin coat. She unlocked the heavy front door, the only thing that seemed sturdy on the entire property, and pushed it open. It shrieked on rusted hinges. Inside it was a time capsule of neglect. Dust motes danced in the fading shafts of light. The main room contained a rusted wood-burning stove, a threadbare sofa covered in a faded floral sheet, and a massive floor-to-ceiling oak bookcase that took up the entirety of the back wall. The air smelled of mildew, old ash, and damp earth. There was no electricity. There was no running water. That first night, Scarlett slept in her coat on the floor, wrapped in a sleeping bag she kept in her trunk for emergencies. She listened to the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, the skittering of mice in the floorboards, and the oppressive, isolating silence of the mountain. She had never felt so utterly alone. But Scarlett Hayes was her father's daughter. The next morning, she woke up with a stiff neck, a freezing nose, and a burning resolve. Hannah and Preston wanted her to fail. They expected her to crawl back, begging for a handout, or simply disappear into poverty. She refused to give them the satisfaction. If she could fix up the cabin, maybe she could sell it. Property in the Cascades, even off-grid, was highly sought after by wealthy Seattle tech bros looking for weekend retreats. She had $10,000. It would be tight, but she could buy basic supplies, a generator, and some tools to patch the roof and clean the interior. For the next 2 weeks, Scarlett worked from sunrise to sunset. She cleared out years of animal nests, scrubbed the wide plank wood floors with bleach and river water. She hauled in buckets and replaced the shattered window panes. Her hands grew calloused, her nails broken, but the physical labor kept her mind off the agonizing betrayal of her family. It was on the 15th day, while taking a break and drinking instant coffee brewed on a camping stove, that Scarlett noticed the discrepancy. She was sitting on the porch, looking at a hand-drawn floor plan she had sketched to calculate how much drywall she needed. She had measured the exterior of the cabin the day before 30 feet across the back wall. But when she had measured the interior living room wall, the one dominated by the massive oak bookcase, It was only 22 feet across. Scarlett frowned, tracing her pencil over the paper. The exterior wall was flat. There were no jutting corners or architectural bump-outs. Where had the other 8 feet gone? She walked back inside and stared at the bookcase. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, wildly out of place in a dilapidated hunting cabin. It was built flush against the wood-paneled wall, stretching from corner to corner, crammed with mouldering encyclopedias, old accounting ledgers, and dusty thriller novels. Scarlett set her coffee down. She walked over to the bookcase and knocked her knuckles against the wood paneling right next to it. It sounded solid. She walked to the other side and knocked again. A hollow thud echoed back. Her heart began to race. She grabbed a crowbar from her toolbox. Moving the heavy, damp books took almost an hour. Once the shelves were cleared, Scarlett braced her shoulder against the side of the massive oak unit and pushed. It didn't budge. She tried again, planting her boots firmly on the floorboards, gritting her teeth with the strain. With a terrible screech of wood on wood, the bookcase slid forward an inch. Panting, she wedged the crowbar under the base and used it as a lever. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy furniture swung away from the wall. Behind it was what looked like standard pine paneling. But as Scarlett ran her dust-covered fingers over the wood, she felt a distinct seam. There was a latch completely hidden in the grain of the wood. She pressed it. The paneling clicked, releasing a heavy hidden door that swung outward into the room. Scarlett gasped, stepping back. Behind the false wall was a narrow corridor, made of poured concrete, explaining the missing 8 feet of the cabin's footprint. She grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from her work belt and clicked it on, aiming the beam into the dark, stale void. At the end of the short corridor stood something that absolutely did not belong in a rotting mountain cabin. It was a vault door, massive gleaming stainless steel, easily 6 inches thick with a heavy rotational wheel and a digital-mechanical hybrid combination lock. Etched into the steel was the logo of the Mosler Safe Company. It was the kind of vault used in high-end jewelry stores or private bank reserves. Scarlett walked toward it slowly, the air growing colder with every step. Why did her father have a bank vault hidden in the woods? What was he hiding? She reached out and touched the cold steel wheel. It didn't budge. She looked at the keypad. It required a 6-digit code. Scarlett stared at it. 10,000 combinations, 1,000,000. She could never guess it. She thought about her father's life, his company's founding date, Hannah's birthday, Preston's. She typed in Hannah's birthday, red light. She typed in the day Hayes Logistics was incorporated, red light. Scarlett stepped back, frustrated. Then a memory hit her. She remembered her father, before the stroke, sitting by her bed when she was a little girl. You and your mother, Scarlett. You're the 2 best days of my life. Never forget that. The day I met her, and the day I met you. Her mother's birthday, October 14th, 1968. October 14th, 68. Her own birthday, March 2nd, 1999. March 2nd, 99. She took a breath and combined them. The year her parents married and the year she was born. 1996 and 1999. 961999. She typed it in. 961999. A heavy mechanical clank echoed through the concrete corridor, followed by the hiss of depressurizing air. A green light illuminated the darkness. Scarlett grabbed the heavy steel wheel, braced her feet, and turned. It spun smoothly, perfectly oiled. With a massive heave, she pulled the heavy vault door open, shining her flashlight into the pitch-black room beyond. What she saw inside made her drop the crowbar. It clattered loudly against the concrete, the sound swallowed by the fortune laid out before her. The beam of Scarlett's heavy-duty flashlight cut through the stale darkness of the vault, illuminating a space roughly the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with heavy, reinforced steel shelving, but it was what sat upon those shelves that made Scarlett's knees buckle. Stacked in neat, precise pyramids were bars of solid gold. They caught the harsh LED light and threw back a warm, intoxicating glow. Beside them sat row upon row of black, waterproof pelican cases. Scarlett approached the nearest one, her hands trembling violently as she popped the heavy latches. Inside, vacuum-sealed in thick plastic, were stacks of $100 bills. Federal Reserve notes, pristine and sequentially numbered. But the true treasure was not the cash or the bullion. It was sitting in the center of the room, on a small stainless steel table, a worn leather briefcase, and a single sealed envelope with her name written on it in her father's familiar, sprawling handwriting. Scarlett tore open the envelope. The heavy cardstock inside was dated exactly 6 months before Arthur Hayes suffered his debilitating stroke. My dearest Scarlett, if you are reading this, it means 2 things. First, I am gone. Second, Hannah showed her true colors and threw you to the wolves, just as I suspected she would. I am so deeply sorry, my brave girl, for the pain you have undoubtedly endured. For the last year, my health has been failing. I've felt the warning signs, the numbness, the cognitive slips. I also discovered a cancer in my life, far worse than any illness Hannah and Preston. 3 years ago, I hired a private investigator to look into discrepancies at Hayes Logistics. What I found was a sophisticated embezzlement ring. Hannah had been funneling company profits into offshore shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. Preston was using our logistics network to smuggle untaxed luxury goods. If I went to the authorities, the scandal would have destroyed the company and the legacy I built for you. If I confronted her directly, I feared what she might do to me while I was medically vulnerable. So I played the fool. I let her think she was winning. I let her manipulate my will, knowing it was the only way to keep her eyes off the real prize. Over the past 2 years, I quietly liquidated my private holdings, sold my shares in external tech startups, and converted everything into untraceable assets. There is roughly $42 million in this room. The briefcase contains the explosive evidence of Hannah's fraud, KPMG audit, trails offshore account numbers, and undeniable proof of her federal crimes. I left you Oakhaven because I knew they would consider it worthless garbage. I knew you were the only one with the grit, the determination, and the sheer willpower to roll up your sleeves and fix it. You earned this, Scarlett. Now take back what is ours. Burn her empire to the ground. All my love, Dad. Tears streamed down Scarlett's face, splashing onto the dusty concrete floor. A heavy, suffocating weight she hadn't realized she was carrying, the fear that her father had truly abandoned her in his final years, evaporated. In its place, a cold, diamond-hard fury began to crystallize. Arthur hadn't left her defenseless. He had left her a war chest. Scarlett spent the next 3 days meticulously cataloging the vault. She packed a single duffel bag with $2 million in cash and the leather briefcase containing the evidence of Hannah's crimes. She locked the Mosler vault, slid the massive oak bookcase back into place, and drove back down the treacherous mountain roads. She wasn't the broken, terrified girl in a thrift store dress anymore. She was a predator. Her first stop in Seattle wasn't a hotel. It was the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed Davis Polk and Wardwell, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the West Coast. She bypassed the standard intake secretaries and demanded a meeting with Richard Montgomery, a senior partner, notorious for his aggressive, scorched-earth tactics in corporate takeovers. When Montgomery, a silver-haired man with eyes like a hawk, saw the 26-year-old girl in muddy boots walk into his office, he looked amused. When she unzipped the duffel bag and dumped $500,000 in banded cash on his mahogany desk to serve as a retainer, his amusement vanished. And when she laid out the KPMG audit trails and the Cayman Island banking records, Montgomery smiled a terrifying shark-like grin. "Miss Hayes," Montgomery murmured, adjusting his silk tie as he studied the documents. "Your stepmother has committed wire fraud, corporate espionage, and tax evasion on a spectacular scale. If these go to the FBI, she faces 20 years in federal prison." "I don't want to just send her to prison, Mr. Montgomery. Oh." Scarlett said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I want to dismantle her. I want her to lose the company, the house, the money, and her reputation. I want her to feel exactly what she made me feel." Montgomery leaned back in his chair. "Hayes Logistics has been struggling since your father's passing. Preston is an idiot who is bleeding the operational budget dry to fund his lifestyle. To keep the company afloat, Hannah just took out a massive $50 million mezzanine loan from Highland Capital Management. They leveraged the Mercer Island estate and their controlling shares as collateral." Scarlett's eyes narrowed. "If they default on that loan, the debt holder takes the company and the house," Montgomery finished. "With the capital you have, we don't just expose her. We create a shell company. We approach Highland Capital and buy Hannah's debt at a premium. We become her sole creditor. And then we spring the trap." For the next 3 months, Scarlett remained in the shadows. She lived in a luxury suite under an assumed name, spending her days working with Montgomery's team of forensic accountants. Through a newly minted blind trust named Oakhaven Holdings, Scarlett quietly purchased the $50 million debt note from Highland Capital. She was now the puppet master, and Hannah's strings were pulled tight. Meanwhile, Hannah and Preston were drowning. Without Arthur's steady hand or Scarlett's operational expertise, Hayes Logistics was losing major contracts to competitors. Desperate to maintain her lavish lifestyle and cover up the massive holes in the company's finances, Hannah brokered a desperate deal. She was going to sell Hayes Logistics to a massive global shipping conglomerate, Apex Maritime, for a fraction of its true value. The deal would wipe out the debt and leave her with enough cash to flee to Europe. The signing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the executive boardroom of the Hayes Logistics downtown headquarters. It was time for Scarlett to collect. The executive boardroom on the 40th floor offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, but Hannah wasn't looking at the water. She was staring greedily at the leather-bound acquisition contracts sitting on the massive marble conference table. She wore a pristine white Dior suit, looking every inch the triumphant matriarch. Preston sat beside her, endlessly tapping his phone, entirely disinterested in the fact that they were selling off Arthur Hayes's life's work. Across the table sat the acquisition team from Apex Maritime, led by a stern-faced Swedish executive named Lars Sorensen. "If everything is in order, Mrs. Hayes Sorensen," said in clipped, precise English, clicking his Montblanc pen, "Apex is prepared to execute the transfer of ownership. We will assume the company's debts, and the remaining $50 million will be wired to your private accounts." Hannah smiled, reaching for the pen. "A pleasure doing business with you, Lars. Arthur would be thrilled to see his little company join such a prestigious global family. Actually, Hannah." A voice rang out from the back of the room. "I think Dad would be violently ill." The heavy oak doors to the boardroom had opened silently. Standing in the threshold was Scarlett Hayes. She was unrecognizable from the weeping, disheveled girl they had thrown onto the street 3 months prior. Scarlett wore a razor-sharp charcoal Tom Ford suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving knot. Flanking her were two men, Richard Montgomery, clutching a thick leather briefcase, and a uniformed federal agent from the FBI's white-collar crime division. Hannah froze, the pen hovering an inch above the signature line. The blood drained from her face. "Scarlett, what on earth are you doing here? Security. How did she get up here?" "Security works for the building owner, Hannah, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, that's me," Scarlett said smoothly, walking into the room. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Preston stood up, his face flushing with anger. "Are you insane? Get out of here, you pathetic little—" "Sit down, Preston, before I have you arrested for the $2 million you embezzled from the logistics pension fund last year." Scarlett snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Preston's jaw dropped, and he collapsed back into his chair, suddenly trembling. Lars Sorensen stood up, looking highly offended. "What is the meaning of this interruption? We are in the middle of a confidential acquisition." Richard Montgomery stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the table and snapping it open. "Mr. Sorensen, I am Richard Montgomery of Davis Polk. I strongly advise Apex Maritime to step away from that table. The woman you are attempting to buy this company from does not possess the legal authority to sell it. Furthermore, she is currently the subject of a massive federal investigation for wire fraud and money laundering." Hannah slammed her hands on the table. "That is a lie. This is slander. I own 60% of this company." Scarlett reached into Montgomery's briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents, tossing them onto the marble table. They slid perfectly across the polished surface, stopping right in front of Hannah. "You did," Scarlett corrected softly, "until you leveraged those shares as collateral for a $50 million mezzanine loan from Highland Capital, a loan you have breached the covenants of by failing to maintain the required liquidity ratios." Hannah sneered. "Highland gave us a 30-day grace period. You know nothing about corporate finance, you little brat." "Highland sold the debt note," Scarlett replied, a deadly calm in her eyes. "They sold it to a private equity firm called Oakhaven Holdings, a firm of which I am the sole proprietor. I am your creditor, Hannah, and I am officially calling in the debt. Effective immediately, you are in default. Your 60% stake in this company, your shares, and the deed to the Mercer Island estate now belong to me." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Outside, a ferry blasted its horn in the harbor, a booming punctuation to the sheer destruction occurring in the room. Hannah looked at the documents. She saw the signatures, the bank transfers, the irrefutable proof that Scarlett had checkmated her. Her pristine, carefully constructed reality was shattering into millions of razor-sharp pieces. "Where?" Hannah choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get $50 million? Scarlett leaned over the table, bringing her face inches from her stepmother's pale, trembling features. "From a rotting shack in the Cascade Mountains. You really should have checked the square footage, Hannah." Lars Sorensen hastily gathered his briefcases. "Apex Maritime is withdrawing its offer. Good day, ladies." The Swedish executives practically sprinted out of the room, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Hannah Hayes and Preston Hayes, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Please stand up and place your hands behind your backs." Preston began to openly weep, babbling about how his mother forced him into it. Hannah didn't cry. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked onto Scarlett, with a mixture of pure hatred and grudging terror. As the cold steel cuffs snapped around her wrists, her pristine facade finally crumbled. "You think you've won," Hannah hissed as the agent led her toward the door. "You're just like him. Cold, calculating, and completely alone." Scarlett watched them drag the woman who had tormented her out of the room. She looked at the empty boardroom, the empire her father had built with his blood and sweat now entirely hers once again. "No," Scarlett whispered to the empty room, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I'm not alone at all. I have my father's legacy." That afternoon, Scarlett returned to the Mercer Island estate. She didn't pack her bags to leave. She stood on the grand balcony, watching the sunset paint the Seattle skyline in hues of gold and purple. Tomorrow she would take over the CEO suite at Hayes Logistics. She would rehire the loyal staff Hannah had fired. She would rebuild the empire. But for tonight, she just stood in the quiet house, the rightful queen returning to her castle, secured by a ghost's ledger and a mountain cabin that held a secret more precious than gold. And that is how Scarlett turned a worthless, rotting cabin into the ultimate weapon of revenge. If you loved seeing Hannah and Preston get exactly what they deserved in the boardroom, smash that like button and share this incredible true-to-life story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping stories of betrayal, hidden fortunes, and epic comebacks. Have you ever found a hidden family secret? Let us know in the comments below.